Picture a small group of people sitting around a fire 10,000 years. No walls around them, no gates, no standing army guarding the perimeter, just open land in every direction, and a handful of families who could pack up and walk away by morning if they wanted to. For a long time, this image has been used to tell a very specific story. Humans, before civilization, were peaceful, gentle, sharing everything, hurting no one. And then something went wrong. Farming, cities, governments, and suddenly humans became violent. Is that actually true? Were we really peaceful before we built walls? Or is that story more comforting than accurate? And if something did change, what actually changed it? This idea has a name. Some call it the noble savage myth, the belief that humans in their natural state were innocent and that civilization corrupted us. It's an old idea, older than most people realize, tracing back centuries to philosophers imagining a pure state of nature before kings, laws, and property lines existed. It's a comforting story. It lets us believe violence is a modern invention, a flaw layered on top of an originally peaceful species, something we built by accident and could, in theory, undo. But comforting stories and accurate stories are not always the same thing. So let's actually look at the evidence, and let's start with what we can verify instead of what feels satisfying to believe. Start with what early hunter-gatherer life really looked like. Groups were small, usually under 100 people. They moved constantly, following food and water across the season. And here's the key detail. They didn't own much because they couldn't carry much. No permanent farmland, no stored grain, no fixed territory worth dying for. If a conflict got serious, the easiest solution wasn't to fight. It was to walk away. Anthropologists have pointed to this mobility as one real reason smaller-scale societies may have experienced less large-scale, organized violence than what came later. No fixed points to defend usually means less reason to defend them with force. There's also the matter of what they had to lose. Many studied hunter-gatherer groups were relatively egalitarian. Food was shared, not hoarded. A successful hunt fed the whole group, not just the hunter's own family. Property was minimal, often limited to what a person could physically carry from camp to camp. Status differences existed. People were respected for skill, wisdom, or generosity. But status wasn't backed by stockpiled wealth the way it would be later. There was no granary to inherit, no fenced field to pass down to your children. When there's little to steal and little to inherit, some of the sharpest motives for violence, jealousy over land, resentment over inherited wealth, a rival family accumulating more than yours, simply have less to attach to. You can't go to war over a harvest that doesn't exist yet. So far, this sounds like it supports the peaceful past idea. But here's where we have to slow down, because the full picture is messier than that. Archaeologists have found something that complicates the story. Skeletal remains from some prehistoric sites do show violence. Head trauma, embedded arrowheads, defensive wounds that suggest someone raised an arm to block a blow and never fully healed from it. This evidence exists in hunter-gatherer contexts too, not only in later farming societies. So the simple version, hunter-gatherers good, farmers bad, doesn't hold up cleanly either. Researchers disagree sharply on how to interpret this. Some argue it shows humans were never truly peaceful, that violence runs deep in our species regardless of lifestyle, and that small mobile groups fought just as often as later societies, just on a smaller scale that leaves less evidence behind. Others argue these cases are scattered, isolated incidents, personal disputes, or one-off raids, and don't add up to anything resembling organized, sustained warfare. A single skeleton with a fractured skull could mean an ambush. It could also mean an accident, or a personal grudge that had nothing to do with tribal conflict at all. The honest answer is that this debate is still open among the people who study it professionally, and anyone who tells you it's fully settled in either direction, purely peaceful past or purely violent past, is oversimplifying a genuinely messy body of evidence. What we can say with more confidence is what happened after agriculture spread. And this is where the real turning point starts to come into focus. Around 10,000 years ago, something enormous changed. Slowly at first, then rapidly across entire regions. Groups stopped moving. They planted crops, and crops take months to grow, so you can't walk away from a field you just planted halfway through the season. You have to stay near it. You have to weed it, guard it from animals, and eventually defend it from people too. Suddenly, land wasn't just a place you passed through on your way to better hunting grounds. It was an asset, tied directly to your survival for an entire year at a time. Lose the field, and you don't just lose a meal, you lose the next several months of food security for your entire family. Stored grain became a target for exactly the same reason. A full granary could feed a family through a harsh winter, keep children alive until spring, or it could just as easily feed a raiding neighbor instead. And unlike a hunted animal, which is gone the moment it's eaten, stored grain sits there, visible, valuable, and vulnerable for months at a time. Population density rose too, and rose sharply. Farming could support far more people per square mile than hunting and gathering ever could, sometimes by a factor of 10 or more. More people living closer together, competing over the same fixed patch of land and the same water source, is a fundamentally different situation than small mobile groups spread thinly across open territory with room to avoid each other entirely. And unlike hunter-gatherer bands, who could simply disperse the moment tension started rising between families, farming settlements couldn't do that. Their homes, their fields, their stored food, their entire accumulated effort of an entire year were all fixed in one place. Leaving meant walking away from everything that they had built and starting over somewhere with no guarantee the land would be any better or any less contested. This is where the archaeological record gets much harder to argue with. At Neolithic sites across Europe, researchers have found mass graves with unusually high rates of head trauma, sometimes affecting close to 1 in 10 individuals. Alongside these remains, they've uncovered stone axes, arrowheads, flint knives, and clubs. Weapons built specifically to injure people, not hunt animals. The timing lines up almost exactly with the spread of farming and permanent settlement. Rising population, growing competition for land, and increasing specialization all appear together in the same window of time. So what actually changed? Not human nature, and not some hidden cruelty that was always secretly there, waiting to come out. What changed was the incentive structure. Hunter-gatherers usually had little worth fighting over, and an easy way to avoid the fight entirely: distance. Farmers had land, stored food, and fixed homes, and nowhere to retreat to if things went wrong. They didn't get crueler. They got something to lose. That single shift from mobile and low stakes to settled and high stakes may explain far more about the rise of organized violence than any story about moral decline ever could. It wasn't a fall from innocence. It was a change in what was on the table. And that reframes the entire question. We like to imagine early humans as either saints or savages, one extreme story or the other, because extremes are simple and simple stories are satisfying. But the evidence points somewhere less dramatic and honestly more useful. The capacity for violence was almost certainly always there, sitting quietly in the background, mostly unused because for most of human history there was rarely enough at stake to justify the risk of using it. Once farming created fixed resources worth defending and worth stealing, that same underlying capacity finally had something concrete to attach to. So picture that fire again, the same people, the same brains capable of both deep cooperation and real conflict, just as they are today. What was missing back then wasn't kindness, and what appeared later wasn't cruelty. What changed was stakes. Once humans built something worth losing, they started fighting to keep it. And once someone else had something worth taking, some of them started fighting to take it. Not because human nature got worse, because human nature finally had something to fight over. So here's the question worth sitting with. If violence tracks what people have to lose, not how good or bad they are, what does that say about the world we've built since? One with far more to own, defend, and lose than any hunter-gatherer ever had. Drop your answer in the comments.